Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Ungar. He is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and Director of Environmental Dynamics at the University of Arkansas. His research focuses on paleoecology and teeth. He is the author of books like Mammal Teeth, Evolution's Bite, and of textbooks like Human Diet, Its Origin and Evolution. So, Dr. Ungar, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show and for accepting the invitation. It's a real pleasure to everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Okay, great. So, it's very interesting that you study teeth because I guess that even though many people probably don't think a lot about it, teeth have been a very important aspect of our anatomy and of our evolution because it then also they also connect with things like how we digest food, the kinds of food that we are able to eat basically, and also then probably with how other features of our anatomy evolved, like our brains and so on. So, my first question would be, could you give us maybe a brief overview of the history behind, how people started studying teeth and more specifically hominin teeth?
Sure. The study of teeth for the reconstruction of diet really began in the early part of the 20th century. There was a paleontologist who's arguably the greatest and best known paleontologist of the century named George Gaylord Simpson. And he developed a new approach to studying fossils, which he called paleobiology, which was to treat fossils as organisms that were once alive in the past. Before then, people looked at fossils and they treated them pretty much like rocks, right? They just basically collected them and categorized them and classified them and reconstructed pictures of what animals looked like in the past. But it wasn't until Simpson in the 1920s and 30s that people started to realize that you can actually take teeth and say something about diet in the past. Human evolution studies proper really didn't begin until the 1920s and 30s as well, when Raymond Dart in South Africa started to discover fossils like the Tong child, which is an early human ancestor. And soon thereafter, his disciples began to apply this paleobiology approach to reconstructing the diets of our ancestors.
Mm-hmm. And so, first people started collecting teeth and trying to establish anatomical comparisons between them. Is that correct? And then only later did they start doing more biochemical analysis, like, for example, to try to find out their composition and also through their composition the kinds of foods that a particular animal ate? Is that the case?
Sure, yeah. Well, at first, researchers would look at teeth and say, oh, look, these teeth are flat. They probably crushed hard foods. Or these teeth are sharp. They probably sliced tough foods. It wasn't until probably the 1960s or 70s that researchers started to use what's called the comparative method to try to really understand the relationship between teeth and diet. You've got to understand how that relationship works in living animals. And so from the 1960s and 70s onward, people began to try to establish that relationship, or at least establish an understanding of that relationship by looking at how teeth of living animals with specific diets vary in a predictable way. And then it wasn't really until probably the 2000s that researchers really began to try to tease apart things like how the chemistry of the teeth relate to diet, how the scratches and pits on the teeth relate to diet. It's what we call food prints, right? And food prints are essentially like footprints in the sand. They're traces of actual activity in the past, rather than just looking at relationships between form and function.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so just to get this right, first scientists tried to understand how they could connect form with function. That is, for example, they looked at different kinds of teeth, like the incisors, the canines, the premolars, the molars, and trying to understand how each kind of teeth served a different kind of function, maybe. And then over time, they started also analyzing teeth in terms of their biochemical composition to try to understand what were the kinds of foods that those teeth were used to chewing or to masticate. Is that?
That's absolutely right. Basically, the first step was to understand how what teeth were capable of eating. And to understand what teeth are capable of eating, you need to look at the shapes of the teeth. Are they good for cutting? Are they good for crushing? And that these are things that are genetically determined, right? If your ancestors evolved to, say, break hard foods, then they had to evolve hard teeth, flat teeth. If they had evolved to break very tough foods, they had to evolve sharp teeth. But the newer approaches, like the biochemistry you're talking about, like the microscopic wear, these don't focus on what your ancestors evolved for or what you're capable of doing, but rather what the animals actually did on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, because there's also this big difference. I'm not sure if it's big or not, but this difference between the kinds of foods that the teeth are prepared to chew or to masticate, and then the kinds of foods that the animal has available in its environment, and that maybe the teeth also serve to process in this case.
Yeah, I mean, what you're bringing up really brings up the concept of what I call the biospheric buffet, right? I think of the biosphere, which is that part of the planet that harbors life, as a sort of giant buffet or smorgasbord, if you will, right? You have a big table with all kinds of different plates of food, and you take your plate and you go up to the table and you pick and choose from whatever's available. The decisions you make, the choices you make, are really what defines you as a species, right? The teeth can tell you something about what kinds of foods are available and what kinds of foods you can consume, right? And they're important. They're the utensils you have to eat with in this analogy. But that food choice is about much more than just what you're able to eat, what's available to you, what your preferences are as well.
And when exactly in the evolutionary history, and I'm not only referring to the evolutionary history of hominins or hominids, but in the evolutionary history of animals in general, do we already know where exactly the first set of teeth appeared?
Sure. Teeth appeared about 500 million years ago. It really came along with the earliest vertebrates. Teeth were what we call co-opted from scales, right? Early fish, jawless fish, had armor on that was basically made up of the same material that our teeth are made up of today. And that armor slowly but surely migrated toward the front of the head and made their way into the area around the mouth. And as the jaws began to evolve, then teeth started to take on more of a current role. So 500 million years, it was with the first vertebrates.
And did they always serve the function of chewing food, or was it the case that in early stages of the evolution of teeth they served other functions?
Well, basically, chewing is a fairly, at least from evolutionary terms, new phenomenon, right? There are a few examples in the fossil record of chewing that go way back, but basically chewing didn't really begin until we got to mammals, right? Mammals have a really high metabolic rate because we're warm-blooded, and we have to get a lot of energy to generate the heat we need to keep our bodies running, and that requires efficient breakdown of food and chewing. Before then, and that's about 200 225 million years ago, teeth were basically used to capture and contain and kill prey. Sometimes they were used to rasp algae off of rocks, or they were used to capture other fish, things like that. But the chewing actually didn't start until about 225 million years ago.
So let's say that you are studying the set of teeth of a particular hominin, for example. You know their anatomy, you know how they come in contact with the teeth from the opposite side and things like that. How do you use that kind of information and probably information from other sources to reconstruct the diet of a particular hominin species?
Well, is only a limited amount of information available, and there's only a limited amount of what we can say. We use all the different tools available to us. Of course, we look at the sizes of the teeth. They can tell us something about the nutrient quality. Larger teeth, lower nutrient quality because you've got to process more food. We look at the sharpness of the teeth. They can tell you whether foods are very tough, or we can tell you whether the foods are very hard. So nuts, seeds, bone versus plant material like leaves and meat. Then we can look at the chemistry of the teeth. That can tell you, for example, whether the plants that are being eaten come from tropical grasses and sedges, or whether they come from tree and bush products. We can look at the microscopic wear on the teeth, which can tell you something also about how hard or tough the food properties were, because scratches mean tough foods, pits mean hard foods. We can even look for food particles that get trapped within the dental calculus or tartar on the teeth. And we've found 2 million-year-old plant particles embedded in the tartar on teeth that tell us, for example, that Australopithecus sediba ate the stems of reeds and bark before it died. So there's a whole bunch of different proxies we can use. And when we combine this information with information about the past environments, reconstructed environments, we can even say something about sort of what was selected within the context of that environment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so when you find human remains or human fossils, you can also find tartar associated with them. I'm asking because I thought that you didn't get tartar to being, let's say, attached to the teeth for such a long time. I thought you only got the teeth.
No, actually, this is a fairly new development, and just a few years ago, my colleagues and I found tartar on a 2 million-year-old Australopithecus skull. And when you go into a clean room and you scrape the tartar off, you can look on the inside and find bits of plants, and they can tell you something about diet. Before our work, people would basically clean the teeth when they pulled them out of the ground, and they removed the tartar without understanding that it was really there. They thought it was just dirt. But once we identified that, that was very useful. And in fact, even now, people have looked at Neanderthals, found tartar embedded in their teeth, and have been able to extract DNA from that tartar and say that, for example, a particular Neanderthal ate woolly rhinoceros meat. So this seems to be an emerging area of research.
Oh, so this is very recent, right? This thing about also studying the composition of tartar, right?
Very, very recent, maybe in the last 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I thought that, tartar is basically mineralized bacterial plaque, right? So I thought that what you would find in tartar would be something like the products of bacteria metabolism or something like that. But you can also find food remains.
Food remains are embedded in tartar. Oftentimes we find them between the tooth itself and the tartar. Mm-hmm. So yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But I will add that it does require special conditions for that to be preserved. If, for example, a skull, if an animal dies on the open savanna and the skull is exposed to the elements for years before it becomes buried, the tartar's probably gone. In the cases where we have found tartar, like, for example, Australopithecus sediba, this was a case where an animal probably fell into a fissure, into a cave, and was immediately buried and preserved. So it's fairly rare that we find this.
Okay, so it has to occur in very special conditions.
Not sure quite how special, but typically we will not find it.
Okay, okay. So let me just ask you this now, because sometimes when we think about evolutionary questions, there are chicken and egg problems. So, I mean, is it the case, or do we already know if teeth come first, or if it's rather the case that diets come first and then teeth only evolve according to the diet of a particular species?
That's an excellent question. In fact, I would argue the way that natural selection works is that you start with a range of variation in tooth form, right? So that variation is there to begin with, and then that variation has to be selected for. So you have to have a dietary condition that puts the animal at an advantage if it has a certain kind of tooth. So I would say that the tooth form has to come first, or at least the variation in tooth form has to come, and then you have to get a diet that puts you at an advantage to have the particular form that you have and pass on more of your genes. So I think teeth.
So, in your account at least, different individuals of the same species or the same population have probably slightly different variations of the same teeth, and then the ones that are more successful with their diets and with producing offspring based on eating a certain type of diet, then those pass on the genes for that specific set of teeth and so on, right?
That is what Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace taught us. I wouldn't take credit for that.
Okay, right. So there's another very interesting question associated with teeth and diets that I think has to do with environment, because the environments are very directly connected with the sources of food that different animals have available to them. So, I mean, can we also use teeth to study the environment that a particular animal evolved in?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the main ways that we reconstruct environment is by finding the set of animals that lived sort of in the same deposits as the hominins were interested in. So, for example, we can excavate a site, and if we find a lot of antelope in the same deposit as a human ancestor, and then we analyze the teeth of that antelope, we can see, for example, whether the chemistry and the wear on those teeth can tell us that that particular animal ate a lot of grass. Right? So if we've got antelopes from a fossil site and they all ate grass, we can say that there was certainly grass available, probably was a more open savanna-like setting. If, on the other hand, the chemistry and the wear on the teeth tell us that those antelopes were eating tree products, that tells us that that deposit was formed in a more forested environment. And that's one of the main ways that we actually reconstruct the environments of our ancestors, by reconstructing the diets of the animals that lived alongside them.
So, since us as humans have spread throughout the entire globe, how easy is it to study our ancestral diets? That is, for example, the diets of our ancestors that evolved back in Africa.
Well, one of the main theories that we have is the theory that humans evolved for a broad spectrum of foods, to be very flexible in terms of their diets. Because what we find is over the past 7 million years, the conditions in Africa have become increasingly variable. Right? So in other words, what seems to have happened is there'd be swings in climate from warm and wet to cool and dry to warm and wet to cool and dry, and those swings have become more and more intense, which means that our ancestors had to evolve to be versatile and flexible, right? And many of us have argued that that dietary flexibility is what's allowed us to move and spread all throughout the world and find something to eat on all of this planet's myriad biospheric buffets.
Mm-hmm. And do we find variation in terms, for example, of the anatomy of the teeth or the configuration, that is, how teeth are disposed in the mouth, or even perhaps traits having to do with the bone or with the muscles that are used for mastication between different human populations that evolved in different environments, or not?
Well, we do a little bit. Just as people vary from one another in their skin colors, in their facial features, in their hair texture, they vary in their teeth. So, for example, people of Asian ancestry tend to have shovel-shaped incisors, whereas those of us of European ancestry tend to have flat incisors. People who are of Australian Aboriginal ancestry or Native American ancestry or Eskimo or Inuit, I should say, ancestry tend to have very large molar teeth, whereas those in Africa have much smaller molar teeth. So there are some kinds of variation in tooth form and jaw size between people.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it the case that because we in our modern societies have diets that are really somewhat disconnected from the diets that we used to have until very recently in our evolutionary history, that perhaps that's one of the reasons why we find differences between our teeth, particularly in terms of, for example, cavities or tooth decay between ourselves and peoples from, for example, hunter-gatherer societies?
Absolutely. You could argue that tooth decay is something that is a fairly new phenomenon. We see a little bit of it in the fossil record. There's a wonderful example, well, actually not so wonderful for the poor guy that died from the dental abscesses, but there's a wonderful example from Zambia of a species called Homo heidelbergensis that had terrible tooth decay, dental abscesses, tooth loss, things like that. But that's fairly rare in the fossil record. And when we look at non-human primates, tooth decay is also fairly rare. We see it occasionally in some fruit-eating monkeys, but by and large, nothing like the 90% of us in the West that suffer tooth decay today. This is a very recent phenomenon. I would say it's not even a Neolithic revolution, an origins of agriculture phenomenon. I would say that it's an industrialization phenomenon. There was a slight increase in dental decay, particularly in the New World where people ate corn and maize with the onset of agriculture. Not so much in the Old World. Rice doesn't seem to be very karyogenic. That is, rice doesn't seem to cause a lot of cavities. Wheat and barley don't seem to cause a lot of cavities. Maybe a little bit more than our hunter-gatherer predecessors. But it really started off with the Industrial Revolution and the wide availability of highly refined and processed sugar, table sugar, for example. That's when it really took off.
Mm-hmm. So it has to do mostly with being exposed to sugar in very high quantities.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens is that sugar basically promotes the growth of the bacteria that cause tooth decay. And with more bacteria, their byproducts after they eat the sugar, they basically poop the acid that demineralizes or erodes your teeth. When you add to that the fact that our diets are not very abrasive and are very soft, Well, then we have little crevices in our teeth that remain throughout our lives. See, hunter-gatherers will oftentimes have very flat teeth with no crevices left because they wear them out. When you combine having a lot of bacteria with having these crevices for them to hide in, that's when the tooth decay begins.
And isn't it the case that in modern societies we tend to have more crooked teeth because of the types of foods that we tend to eat? Like I think that we eat more smooth foods and things like that, and maybe in hunter-gatherer societies they have to deal with harder, tougher kinds of foods. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So our teeth evolved for a certain size jaw, right? And when you look, most of your listeners will probably have crooked and crowded lower front teeth. The upper front teeth will probably jet out in front of the lower front teeth. They'll likely have impacted wisdom teeth as well. So the teeth in the front and the back are crowded because the jaw is too small for our teeth. Most hunter-gatherers, most sort of early agriculturalists as well, the teeth fit perfectly in the jaw because the jaws were longer. The jaws were longer because when the individuals were children, they would put a lot of stress on those jaws for chewing hard or tough foods. When you put stress on a bone, what does it do? It responds by making more bone to buttress and strengthen itself, right? Because the osteoblasts, those are the cells that produce bone, are constantly secreting that bone in response to the trauma or the stress of heavy chewing. And when that happens, the jaw grows longer. So basically, nature has to make a certain guess as to how much pressure you're going to put on your jaw in your life when it decides how big to make your teeth so it fits into that jaw. In our case, our children their teeth are not put in enough stress, and the result is having jaws that are too small for our teeth.
So it has to do mostly with stimulating the growth of the bone during our development, right? Because I thought that it could also have to do with the fact that because hunter-gatherer peoples use their teeth a little bit more because they have to chew tougher and harder foods, then maybe maybe the size of the teeth would decrease a little bit from their usage or something like that.
Sure, the old theory, actually, an Australian orthodontist named Begg originally came up with this theory in the early 20th century, was that the problem is not that our jaws are too small for our teeth, but that our teeth are too big for our jaws, and that in nature, we wear our teeth down. And in wearing your teeth down, they become smaller and they would fit into the jaws. That's really not the case. The amount that you wear between your teeth to make more room or to be able to fit in the jaw is really not that much. And you see dental crowding in 12-year-olds, for example. But at that age, there really isn't that much wear of the teeth, even in populations that wear their teeth a lot. The problem with this is that because that was the old theory, orthodontists in the United States at least, and actually around the world, have developed this strategy where they think the best thing to do is to pull out some teeth, and then usually they pull out the premolars in the front, what we call the anterior bicuspids, and then they string wires around the rest of the teeth and pull them all together, right? So the idea is to make the teeth fit the jaw size, when in reality, from an evolutionary perspective, they should really be focusing on making the jaws bigger to fit the existing teeth, because that's what is natural. They should be putting spacers in. And a lot of dentists and orthodontists, at least in the United States, are coming to realize this and really changing their approach. Because if you take teeth out, what you're basically doing is you're reducing the jaw length, and that can have really, really bad implications for your airway, for example. When your mouth is short, there's not as much room behind the tongue for you to breathe, and that leads to all kinds of complications like sleep apnea. So thinking about oral health, thinking about orthodontics from an evolutionary perspective can probably contribute a lot towards the best strategy for treating this discordance, this disconnection or mismatch between the environments in which our teeth evolved and the environments that we find them in today.
So changing topics a little bit now, have we already been able to completely reconstruct the evolution of our diets, starting from, for example, our last common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos? Or are there still missing parts of it?
Oh, there are a lot of missing parts. Like I said, there's only a few things that we can talk about. We can talk about whether fruits or leaves or meat or bone dominated the diet. But the other thing to remember is that diet probably varied over the geographic range of any given species, right? Remember we talked about the biospheric buffet. The hominin, Homo habilis, if you want to use that species as an example, the Homo habilis diet likely varied depending upon whether you're looking at individuals that lived in the forest or those that lived on the lakeshore or those that lived on the bank of the river, depending upon what was available to it. So I don't think, even if you could completely reconstruct the diet of a fossil individual, you can't really talk about the diet of that species because it varied, just as our diets today vary.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Okay, so but during our evolution, we were talking, for example, about how different animal species were exposed to different types of foods and they had a set of teeth, and then through variability between individuals and by some of them eating different types of foods, then they eventually evolved a particular set of teeth. But in our case, isn't it also the case that we have to introduce into the equation things like the fact that we were able to use tools and also from a certain point on fire and things like that to basically change our food and to digest it more easily?
Yes, that makes our job as paleoanthropologists that study teeth and how that relates to diet more difficult, because the teeth can only tell us about the material properties of the foods as they enter the mouth, right? Once you start processing those foods outside the mouth by cutting them up, by pounding them, by cooking them, that changes their properties, and the teeth only see the properties of what enters the mouth. Now I will say that there is a general trend or a pattern for teeth to get smaller and jaws to get smaller through human evolution, which is consistent with more and more processing of foods outside the mouth. That certainly happened, and it was certainly important.
Is it the case that teeth configuration evolves in tandem with our digestive systems? Because I would imagine that with our teeth we would be able to eat things that maybe we wouldn't be able to digest, and possibly vice versa. So when you look at the evolution of teeth, is there any direct relationship with the set of teeth and what they allow the animal to eat and its digestive system?
What an interesting question. I've never been asked that before. It's really hard to know because we don't have access to digestive systems in the past. We do know, thinking through this now, that there is an association between tooth form and digestive anatomy in living mammals, because those that have, say, teeth designed for shearing tough vegetation tend to have larger digestive systems to house microorganisms to break down the cellulose, the material that cell walls are made from, and that animals with very sharp teeth tend to have much simpler guts because the meat that they're eating doesn't require a lot of digestive enzymes to or microorganisms to take care of them. So I would say there probably is an association between tooth form and gut form. But to the best of my knowledge, I don't know anybody that's actually gone in and done a comprehensive study across the mammals to relate those two things, in part because we don't have access to gut form in the fossil record anyway.
Right. I mean, there are sometimes on the internet we find those kinds of memes where people create a table and they present different sets of teeth, and then they say that this kind of teeth corresponds to an herbivore animal, that kind to an omnivore, and that kind to a carnivore, and so on and so forth. I mean, is it the case that really just by looking at the teeth of a particular animal, we are able to immediately say if it is an herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore?
Probably yes. We've got a really good handle on the general relationships between those very broad diet categories and tooth shape. So if you were to hand me a fossil tooth, I could tell you pretty clearly whether it belonged to a dog or cat-like carnivore, or whether it belonged to a sheep or cow-like herbivore, or whether it belonged to a pig or bear or human-like omnivore.
And it has to do with what exactly would you say? With maybe the shape of the teeth or the number of different types of teeth? Or what?
Well, it has to do with the shapes of the cheek teeth or molar teeth, right? Because typically an herbivore will have flat teeth with long parallel ridges of enamel that run opposite of the direction of chewing movement. So for example, if you think of a rasp or an old style washboard where you have to push the clothes against these ridges, that's for grinding and milling tough vegetation. When you have sharp bladed teeth that come together like a pair of scissors, that tends to be for slicing or shearing through tough meat. When we've got teeth with rounded cusps that fit neatly into basins, that's for grinding or crushing through a variety of foods that an omnivore would eat. And we see this over and over again across the mammals. And this is a pattern that that we see in all different kinds of mammals. We see it evolving independently in marsupials, that is the mammals like the kangaroos from Australia, and the placental mammals like us. So we see this range of variation evolving independently, but the same shapes are corresponding to the same kinds of diets, even though they evolved separately and independently.
Mm-hmm. And in our case, the teeth that we have correspond to the teeth of an omnivore, correct?
That's correct. Our teeth look very much like bear teeth or pig teeth.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, teeth of an animal that is able to eat both meat and different kinds of meat and plants.
That's correct. That's pretty much what our teeth look like. We don't have the very specialized flat teeth with the parallel blades like an herbivore. We don't have the very specialized sort of shearing crested blade-like teeth of a carnivore.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you know, I've also asked you this question because nowadays, with issues surrounding veganism and things like that, sometimes people make arguments saying that, for example, we are not really omnivores because we have teeth that are not prepared to process meat or something like that, but only to eat plant or food from plant sources. But I mean, that doesn't make sense, right?
Right. Well, this is an argument that actually dates back hundreds of years. People have been arguing back and forth as to what our teeth are designed for in terms of diet forever. So, for example, you've heard of Pythagoras from the triangle formula?
Yes, he was a vegetarian, right?
Not only was he a vegetarian, he was the patron saint of ethical vegetarianism. He once said how wrong it is for flesh to be made of flesh, And the argument hasn't really changed for thousands of years. If you get on the PETA website, you'll see the very same argument. On the other hand, today we have people like, well, in the United States, there was a woman who ran for vice president named Sarah Palin, a very avid hunter. And Sarah Palin made the argument in her book, Going Rogue in American Life. She said something to the effect of, if God had not intended us to eat animals, why did he make them out of meat? So, and you know what? This argument goes back. I mean, even if you look in the Bible, Adam and Eve were basically, if you ask somebody who follows the Bible, they'll tell you they were given all the plants on the planet to eat. They were vegetarians. But then Noah was also given the animals to eat. So the arguments go back and forth, and people who have looked to sort of the ancestral human diet, what we evolved to eat, what God made us to eat, even if you would prefer to use that argument, have been discussing and arguing and fighting over this for millennia.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, it's interesting that you refer to people like Pythagoras and others, because I guess that what happens there in that kind of discussion is that people somewhat conflate ethical arguments with scientific data and description about how our teeth work and our digestive systems, because they sort of want for us to be herbivores in that case, just because they don't like the idea of eating meat.
Yeah, we have the guts of a carnivore. There's no question about that. If you look at all living herbivores, their guts are much more elaborate and metabolically expensive than ours are. We're basically designed for a high quality diet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just ask you one last question that also has to do with diet. Does the paleo diet make sense in any way?
Well, I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a dietitian, and I can't speak with any authority about the nutritional costs and benefits of the Paleolithic diets. But from an evolutionary perspective, it does not make a lot of sense to me, because as we've discussed, there is no single diet of our ancestors. It varied over time and it varied over space as the biospheric buffet changed.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it doesn't make sense probably to talk about a paleo diet because there was a lot of variability, and particularly because people were spread throughout the globe and ate different things in different places.
Exactly, and it's not even just spread throughout the globe. It's spread across the savanna. The microhabitats in a small area probably varied a great deal. And from one decade to the next, foods available would have changed as well.
Mm-hmm. And wasn't it also the case that even before the Neolithic arrived, there were already people consuming cereals and things like that? Because we tend to associate cereals with agriculture, but wasn't it the case that at least in certain tribes, in certain places, they were already consuming those types of food?
Sure. Well, cereal grains have a long history in the human diet. We have Neanderthals. We talked about the tartar. There's actually barley that's been found embedded in Neanderthal tartar. During the height of the last ice age, 10,000 years before the origins of agriculture, we have wild rye, wild wheat, wild barley at some sites. So again, it's more a matter of what was available to that particular individual at a moment in time in the past. Now, that's not to say that people in the past ate the kinds of levels and degrees of these cereal grains that we do today. They didn't. The reason that we eat so many cereal grains is because we've got 7 billion people on the planet, and there's not enough resources to feed everybody meat, right? I mean, what can you feed 7 billion people? Well, what grows all over the place? Grass. And cereal grains are basically grass. And so that's why they've become such an important part of our diets today.
So maybe the paleo people have a point when they say that perhaps we eat too much of certain types of foods and particularly processed foods, but maybe they are wrong when they say that we shouldn't consume certain types of foods. I mean, that there are types of foods that we should completely eliminate from our diets.
Well, I mean, I'm sure there are foods that would be best eliminated from our diets. French fries and milkshakes we don't have to eat. But I drink milkshakes and I eat French fries. I mean, if the evolution of human diet is anything to teach us, it's that we're capable of consuming a broad spectrum of foods, and variety is the spice of life.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Unger, let's end on that note. But before we go, would you like to tell people what would be some of the best sources on the internet or otherwise for them to get in touch with your work?
Sure. I have a piece in the current special issue of Scientific America's. There was a special issue on human evolution in Scientific American. That's out. I've got a number of blogs out on the internet. My book Evolution's Bite is really written for a popular or trade audience by Princeton University Press. That's a good one. And if you're interested in human evolution in general, you might visit the Smithsonian Institution's Virtual Hall of Human Ancestors, or Human Evolution.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting. So, Dr. Unger, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, you can also support me via Subscribestar or PayPal. And please share the video, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karin Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ankata, Jacob Klinkby, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart, and also my three producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.